that forget America, white America is an irredeemably racist country, and that the only course for the Negroes is to bring about a final, violent, apocalyptic confrontation of black and white.
As Governor of the State of Michigan, I do hereby officially request the immediate deployment of federal troops into Michigan to assist state and local authorities in reestablishing law and order in the city of Detroit. I am joined in this request by Jerome P. Kavanaugh, Mayor of the city of Detroit.
Pillage, looting, murder, and arson have nothing to do with civil rights.
You're going to sit in front of your television set and listen to LBJ tell you that violence never accomplishes anything, my fellow Americans. But you see, the real problem with violence is that we have never been violent. We have been too nonviolent.
To the Real News, I'm Kim Brown. So imagine sending your kid to school every day, and by the time they reach the 3rd grade, they still can't read. That's what's been happening with children attending underperforming elementary schools in California. Kids either reading far below their grade level or not being able to read at all. Well, some parents, teachers, and advocacy groups banded together and sued the state, arguing that literacy is a constitutional right. And now California has agreed to pay a $53 million settlement, much of which will be earmarked towards 75 schools that need it the most. And today we're joined with Macy Chin. Macy is from a group called CADRA, which is an organization that was one of the lead plaintiffs in this lawsuit. CADRA is led by Black and Latino parents whose kids attend the Los Angeles Unified School District, and they work to stop the push-out crisis in schools serving low-income neighborhoods of color. Macy is the executive director and co-founder of CADRA, and she joins us today from New York. Macy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get some more information about exactly what the nuts and bolts of the suit was. This was filed back in 2017, and it named California's Department of Education and State Board of Education as defendants, and a girl named Ella was the lead plaintiff. So what were the circumstances that compelled this lawsuit?
Well, certainly I just want to put in context, given your introduction, that this is obviously clearly a national crisis. So we recognize the opportunity to really push the state of California, given that we do have the right to education in our state constitution, to really start to look at the pillars that impede, and that if the pillars are not in place, that quality education is just not achievable. And so we took literacy. There were a group of students in both Los Angeles and Stockton who were reading 3-4 levels below as early. I mean, they were even behind in some cases in 1st and 2nd grade, and that they were being approached with this idea of telling their story. But they were also, there was also older kids who had been behind in their earlier grades. And so we were seeing both immediate impact as well as, students who had already suffered from not being able to read in their early grade.
When you say that children were reading many grades below their level, it really set in my mind a couple of things. First of all, right. How we are over 60 years removed from Brown versus Board of Education, and separate but equal was ruled unconstitutional, and yet a lot of areas, a lot of school systems are still dealing with that exact thing.
Absolutely. I think that's what I want to say is this is a long road. It's like we've sort of made a dent in another part of the road. As many folks know, this is all stemming from decades of historical exclusion from the educational process. The basic needs that need to be met to ensure that literacy can even be achieved, those are things that we're all still fighting for. And so the promise of the right to literacy is really what inspired this lawsuit. And inspired CADRA to join it because many of our parents were those same children decades ago. And they're living their adult lives trying to be advocates, successful advocates for their children who are still going to school in the same systems under maybe worse conditions, actually. And so this right to literacy is really an intergenerational struggle. That's why our parents decided for a cadre to join it. And when they heard the stories of young people who were 8 or 9 and couldn't write their name or were unable to demonstrate a complete sentence, it brought them back to their own literacy journeys. And I think that's what's really been the biggest opportunity here, is to actually share the intergenerational impact of this crisis.
So there's a lot of people that can relate to being undertaught or ill-prepared going through public school. But then there's some people who cannot relate to what you're talking about at all. So if these children were being sent to school every day, what did their school day consist of? If they weren't being taught how to read and write, what were they doing?
Well, I think that is a great mystery. One of the plaintiffs in our lawsuit, Mr. Moak, who was a teacher at one of the schools in which, where a couple of the plaintiff students went to school, really shared stories about the fact that when you're disengaged from what you're being taught or you don't understand it, obviously, and there are other things possibly going on at home or in your surroundings, that leads primarily to behavioral issues or challenges or behavior. It manifests as behavior. And so in many cases, there's attempts to do instruction, but without those additional supports, be it enough teachers, enough individual attention, culturally respectful and responsive and relevant materials, the time for that one-on-one type of instruction. Without those supports, without that model, then everyone reading at the same time, the same page, at the same hour of the day, the children who fall behind are definitely just going to become more and more disengaged. And that's why we really saw this as an opportunity to link the two together. But we really saw this as an opportunity to say there's a reason why young people and children get pushed out. There is a disengagement that is happening because the conditions for learning are not there. And often low test scores are blamed just on the student being, not on par. And so we, Mr. Moak and others, and our parents, and we have also always known for decades that not being able to read leads usually to behavioral challenges that then cause children to be pushed out.
So I want you to go back and define, if you could, the term push out, because I don't think it's a generally known term, or it's not universal. Right. So tell me what you mean by preventing push out of students, especially students of color that come from certain neighborhoods in LA.
So that is actually a great question, this term push out. I realized as I was using it that it may not be as familiar, so I appreciate the chance to explain that for us, push out is really shifting the focus of what most people would consider dropout, than an individual act of leaving school, not finishing school. Push out really refers to the reality that there are numerous, pressures and forces and conditions that often lead to, leaving school as really the best option. When we first started doing this work a couple of decades ago, there were also many, many stories of children sort of being counseled out, because it just wasn't worth it for them to keep coming. And it's almost like if they were counted on the list, on the roster, then they had to be tested. If they didn't show up for the test or they didn't do that well, certainly that hurts a lot of schools' bottom lines. And there has been a couple of decades where students were actually either encouraged to leave by counselors and school personnel, or they actually left because nothing was actually in place for them to succeed. And the trauma of that, and of being in a place that you completely don't relate to.
So some of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit hail from 3 specific elementary schools: LaSalle Avenue Elementary in LA, Van Buren Elementary in Stockton, and another school in Inglewood. I'm sorry, the name escapes me at the moment. But the children who are part of this lawsuit came from these schools. And what engaged them to, I guess, be selected to be part of this lawsuit, to be the plaintiffs? And what was their take about it? How did the kids feel, and did they understand exactly what was happening in terms of this lawsuit moving forward?
Well, certainly, lawsuits like this that are based on children's experiences, it takes a long process of building a relationship of trust, primarily with the parents, to have multiple interviews to really find out what's going on. our attorneys did a lot of groundwork before we even actually got introduced to the lawsuit. There had already been a lot of fact-finding, story gathering, and really at the end of the day, I want to just say I think it does come down to both the student and the parent and their parent or guardian really feeling they can share the story without retaliation or without being without backlash. And so that's a necessary condition, I think, for most of these lawsuits to even come forth. And so they ended up spending time with attorneys and really telling their story over and over again, trying to find out exactly what type of instruction they got. When the parents advocated for their students and went to the office and said, my child is behind, what were the school's responses? And certainly the parents' story of advocacy around their children, repeatedly asking for more support and not getting it, that was also part of the story. And then, certainly our attorneys looked at writing samples and compared these students at these schools to other students around the state. Looked at the resources that were devoted to literacy, compared those to other places around the state. So really it was a composite, I would say, of lots of pieces of information to really paint this picture. That literacy was in crisis, but certainly there was not the urgency and the supports to address it.
In fact, according to the lawsuit, 11 of the nation's 26 lowest performing large school districts are in California, and some of the plaintiffs, as I mentioned, hail from schools in that area. But another component of the settlement, and tell me, Macy, if I'm getting this right or wrong, is that the state has to advise the public school systems about how best to reduce the disparity and disproportionate rates of discipline between Black and brown students versus that of white and Asian students. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Well, that is, one of the most, for us at Cadre and our parent leaders who've been working on school push out and ending it for 18 years, that was a very important part of the remedies that we sought. We wanted to make sure that a crisis in literacy or a low test score was seen in the context of a much bigger picture. That these students were attending schools that have always been poorly resourced, under-resourced, and at LaSalle, there was a momentary investment, an infusion of resources. Wonderful materials, a special intervention program designed for the most struggling readers, a faculty member who was dedicated and devoted to serving young people, got to teach the class. There was all kinds of supports put in place. And then those supports were taken away because the grant was over. For whatever reason, the resources ended. And so what that proved was that if the resources were there, even in the most dire situations, that progress could be made. And I think what's important about this lawsuit is that when those resources are not there, and to link it, as I mentioned earlier, to this notion that when you're disengaged from learning and you start acting up, and first of all, you might be 6 or 7 or 8 years old, that in the schools that are more resourced and supposedly higher achieving, they tend to solve these crises with resources and support. In the very under-resourced schools, these crises are often left to linger. Students are passed on, getting further and further behind. So they accumulate being behind at even greater degrees, and then it becomes much more difficult to address later on, even if there are more resources. So what we're hoping is that by serving these elementary schools, catching these students at the earliest stages, earliest indications of being behind, the other effects of poverty, of being, whether it be hungry or not having stable housing, of having parents who are incarcerated or not having your parents, period, not having physical safety and security, that all these root causes are analyzed as part of the problem, and that the solutions that these schools, if they are eligible to receive the money and they apply to receive some extra infusion of money, that they will address this problem holistically and address the conditions, the other conditions that are necessary for any literacy intervention to actually be successful.
So Macy, the settlement amount is $53 million with the state of California. It still has to be approved, I believe, by the state legislature. And $50 million is supposed to go directly to 75 underperforming schools. My obvious question is that enough money? And how long will $50 million last 75 schools, given the amount of, I guess you could say, neglect that these students have endured, as you mentioned, over a period of generations?
So $50 million is half a drop, if that, in the bucket. And we know that. So the hope is that in the 3 years that we can use this additional $50 million, that it will set a precedent. And so, it will guide other districts, other schools to begin to opt in to using their resources this way. Any district at any time could essentially create the very same program that this settlement has, includes. And they could inspire and cause their schools to do a root cause analysis to address this holistically and to allow for uses of the fund, allow the funds to be used for the other sort of associating factors that impede a child's ability to learn. That, most of the time funding is restricted from doing that. It's often very, very prescriptive. And so we are truthfully hoping that this is a precedent setting. It creates a template to learn from and to figure out how best to deploy our resources going into the future, especially when California is up and has choices ahead of us on, in November to actually create a huge infusion of resources for education. We still have to be much better at how we deploy them. And quite frankly, our parent leaders have seen money been thrown at the problem for decades, and yet the fact that we had to file this lawsuit was proof positive that money itself, in and of itself, is not the answer. It's really how we're deployed, the truth of the matter that is allowed to come to the surface, whether parents are fully engaged in the solution, whether the intergenerational effects of the community that they've been living in is taken into account. And it was very important for us that coming out of this, that a lack of literacy is not blamed on the child. It's not, the child is not solely to blame, neither is the parent or neither is the community. And that we start to humanize this literacy crisis, one that is happening in so many communities around the country, certainly not just in California.
Exactly. Well, 11 out of 26, which is nearly half of the largest underperforming school districts in the country, are in California. And hopefully the settlement of the lawsuit, Ella T versus the state of California, in which the state has agreed to settle for $53 million to contribute to underperforming schools and to address literacy rates among children, especially in the third grade, is where this benchmark was mainly set. So we've been speaking today with Macy Chin from the group Cadre, which is an organization, one of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit. Cadre is led by Black and Latino parents whose kids are enrolled in the Los Angeles Unified School District, and they work to stop the push-out crisis in schools serving low-income neighborhoods of color. Macy, we appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us so we could share this story about why we joined this historic lawsuit. Thank you.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.
Our series, School Matters, features extended stories and investigations on education. And today, we're looking at a lawsuit winding its way through the federal appeals process that questions whether access to literacy is a constitutional right. A federal judge in Michigan recently ruled it wasn't when he dismissed a 2016 case. That case claimed students in some of Detroit's lowest performing schools were denied access to literacy due to poor management, discrimination, and underfunding. CBS This Morning Saturday co-host Michelle Miller shows us how students and teachers are fighting for the rights of all students. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning. For years, the Detroit public schools were under control of emergency managers who were trying to lift the district out of debt. But this case has drawn national attention because of its wide-ranging implications, possibly leading to federal changes to the education system.
Everybody ready? There is no escaping the alarming fact that performance at many Detroit public schools is sagging.
I often have conversations with my students. They would say, you know, we feel like people don't care about us. We have a book where Bill Clinton is the president. And it was actually the same book I used when I was in middle school.
You're kidding.
No.
Although now relocated to another Detroit school, Rodney Fresh used to teach at one of the schools named in a class action lawsuit, which accuses the state of systemic, persistent, and deliberate failure to deliver instruction and tools essential for access to literacy, which serve almost exclusively low-income children of color.
It wasn't just like 1 or 2 students.
How many students are we talking?
40 to 50 students that read anywhere between the 1st grade and 6th grade level and the 10th or 12th grade.
You welcome this lawsuit?
Yes.
Superintendent of Detroit Public Schools Nikolai Vitti, who was appointed just last year, is attempting an overhaul.
You really believe that children in this district were used as political pawns?
Walking into a system that was not run appropriately gives me evidence that decisions were made not in the best interest of children.
But you've gone one step farther. You said that the policies in place were racist.
I have, and they are, because the governance system that existed in Detroit would never, ever have been acceptable in any suburban district in this country, anywhere.
Government figures suggest Detroit children are falling behind. Only 5% of the city's 4th grade students can read at or above a proficient level. For Detroit's 8th graders, that number rises to only 7%.
How does this happen? I mean, students are saying that they were denied their basic constitutional rights.
A student in kindergarten, for example, wasn't even exposed to kindergarten standards, so we're setting children up for failure.
Jamarie Hall says he was one of those children set up to fail, one of the original members of the plaintiff class.
Coming from Detroit, they always say 9 times out of 10, you're barely going to graduate high school, you're going to end up in jail, things of that nature. So I just don't want to be a statistic.
Hall now lives in Tallahassee, attending community college in hopes of getting into Florida A&M University.
Just how far behind are you?
It makes me almost feel like I'm dumb sometimes, or I'm not as smart as I need to be. But yeah, I know it's not my fault. I know it's just the school system that I came from.
Do you know what reading level you're reading at now?
I'm probably just getting to about a junior or senior in high school.
So when you think about the possibilities out there, do you feel cheated?
Yes, always. Like we're 10 steps behind, like we're always trying to catch up.
I mean, if this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court and it's struck down, or it's not even heard, what then?
At least we tried. Because at the end of the day, that's all you can do, is say that I tried.
We reached out to both the Michigan Governor Rick Snyder and the state's Board of Education for an interview request and comment. They told us they could not comment on pending litigation. John?
10 steps behind, always trying to catch up. Thank you, Michelle.
No such thing as a nonviolent revolution. The only kind of revolution that's nonviolent is the Negro revolution. The only revolution based on loving your enemy is the Negro revolution. That's no revolution. A revolution is loving. Revolution is hostile. Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way. And you sitting around here like a knot on the wall saying I'm going to love these folks no matter how much they hate me.
You call us savages and beasts and mad dogs running the street burning and looting, but we're doing this not for the destruction of the world, but we're trying to prove one point. We want freedom and justice and equality. We want to be treated equal. The best thing to do is give us freedom or at this place a riot with blood.
Here in Detroit, a city of war.